Hi, this is Joyce Polino Crane. I am here today with my good friend and colleague, Lylah Alphonse, who at the moment is the editor for news at the U.S. News and World Report. This is my cheat sheet, Lylah. And welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
I'm happy to have you here. Lylah and I both worked at the Globe for a while. She was there for 16 years, but before that, she, in between her current job and her Globe years as an editor and writer, you were at Yahoo.com for 3 years.
That's right.
And you started your career in Princeton, New Jersey at, I love the name of this paper, the Princeton Packet.
That's right. It's a little Dow Jones newspaper. It came out twice a week. Still does. Still there.
I'd love to see it. It just sounds adorable.
It's a good paper.
And you often appear on the WGBH show Greater Boston with Jim Braude.
That's right.
Which when I saw you for the first time, had you all up there on Facebook, took pictures of you. Go, Lylah. I thought it was so exciting.
Thank you. It's a lot of fun, actually. It's a fun gig, and there's so much going on right now in news. It's nice to be able to be a little bit of a pundit to talk about what's going on and what I think matters, and you know, how it relates to the other stuff going on in our lives.
How did you get the gig?
I ran into one of his producers, Azita, at the Democratic National Convention in Philadelphia in July. She and I have been friends for a while also. And she asked me to do stand-up from the convention, which I did.
I saw that.
And that was a lot of fun, too.
Yeah, that was great.
You're on this little balcony, and there's a very thin wooden ledge stopping you from tumbling into the audience below, so it's best not to look back.
Oh.
But yeah, we did a little bit of a news analysis there about what was going on. And then after that, she asked me to come and be on the show, and I've been doing it 3-4 times a month since then.
And I love it every time you're on. I tune right in. But tell us a little bit about your current job at U.S. News and World Report.
Sure.
What are, you know, I'm on Facebook with you, so I do see some of the exciting
pot stirring.
Yeah. Well, the perks is what I want to say, that you get to go to some of the events that are
Sure. Well, I'm the managing editor for news, so that means I oversee our news operations. When you hear U.S. News and World Report, a lot of people think of our hospital rankings, our college rankings, and we do a lot of that. That's on the product side, and we also do a lot of consumer advice, which is the consumer side, and I'm on the news side. And there's kind of a thick wall in between all of those divisions. But so I handle coverage of the big national political issues, so politics, policy, energy and environment, the economy, national security, foreign affairs, jobs, that kind of thing. No entertainment, no Kardashians. I have a no Kardashian policy.
Oh.
I'm sorry, unless one of them runs for office or dies, I'm not going to be writing about it. We don't do sports, though we do have AP, so you will see that content on our site. So it's a small compared to the Globe newsroom, about 25 people. And we have a separate opinion section. Well, it's part of news, but there's a separate managing editor for opinion. And on that side, there's a really good balance of left, right, and center. So all told, the news and opinion section does a pretty good job of explaining why things matter. The news analysis that you don't really get from the TV or the radio or news aggregate sites like HuffPost or Yahoo.
So you do the more in-depth reporting.
The news analysis.
That we so badly need in this country at this point.
It's nice to be able to focus on the big issues. And it's also nice to have the luxury of not having to chase every tiny little baby step of every little story. There's a big event, we're there. We're explaining the ins and outs of it. We're giving context. And that's really why a lot of our readers turn to us.
So talk a little bit about the campaign, the presidential campaign, and how you covered it and what that was like this year.
I would call it the craziest campaign I've ever had to follow or cover. You started out with this clown car, for lack of a better word, with the sheer number of candidates piling out of the car and onto the stage on the Republican side. And on the Democratic side, you had an assumption that was just proven not to be true. A lot of people assumed it was going to be Hillary Clinton as the candidate. It would be a kind of very cut and dried, rubber stamp approval, there you go. And instead, Bernie Sanders lit a fire under a good chunk of this country, inspired a lot of people, and succeeded in pushing the Democratic Party farther to the left, which I don't think a lot of people saw coming. A lot of people may have felt it was necessary, but I don't think they saw that coming. Certainly the election itself was quite an upset. I think there are lots of different reasons for that. And I also think there's a good portion of the country who didn't see it as an upset at all. It just seemed like the logical conclusion of what had happened during the campaign and where our country needed to go. So lots to write about is probably the best way to put what's happening now.
Did you do any analysis on the outcome of the election with the polls indicating that Hillary Clinton would win, and then we all woke up to the surprise? Actually, I went to bed late that night, so I knew it before I went to sleep that Trump had won.
I think we cover the polls all along, and the crazy thing about polls is you see one poll or another saying this person's ahead or that person's up by a couple of points, and the individual poll is really just a snapshot in time. It actually doesn't matter much, but the overall trend matters. And even with looking at that overall trend, I think a lot of people were still gobsmacked by the results. But polls are only as accurate as the number of people in them, and there's a margin of error, and it depends on who you call and when. If you're polling only people using landlines, you miss out on that huge swath of the population that gave up their landline and only uses a cell phone.
Cell phones.
If you poll only using cell phones, you give up that huge swath of the population, like my parents, who can't get service in their house and relies on their landline. If you poll only online, you miss I think it's 55% of the country that doesn't have high-speed internet and maybe couldn't participate even if they wanted to. So it's difficult to judge the accuracy of any one poll, but overall, I think some people were very surprised by the outcome, and other people just knew this was going to happen.
Well, so there's been a lot of discussion on the media on how we as journalists and reporters failed to report, the real story. But I don't believe that. I believe that we as journalists were reporting the information that we were being given. It wasn't. We're not always necessarily conducting the polls. I mean, some journalists, some operations do, but for the most part, we're taking the information and presenting it. How do you feel about that?
I think that we were distracted a lot. And there are lots of different media in the media. I mean, the way broadcast operates is different from the way online print operates, is different from the way a major metro newspaper like the Washington Post or the New York Times operates. And that's all different from the way radio operates. But I think overall, we were distracted. We had a candidate on one side who has spent his life in the spotlight, who understands reality TV and knew how to use the networks to that advantage, to really highlight not just his message, but his brand and his personality. And on the other hand, you had a candidate, let's say nominee, since I'm just talking about those two, who had policy, reams of policy, decades of experience, and still couldn't connect, didn't have the same marketing and PR, the natural marketing and PR ability that the Republican nominee had. So it became USA, the reality show, in a lot of ways. And one person knew how to do that game and the other didn't.
Yeah, it was remarkable.
But I also think that the media's job was complicated by a lot of the fake news, clickbait, and propaganda sites that are out there. And frankly, it was complicated by social media. So if you look 4 years ago, social media was here, but most people weren't using it as a news source. Look 8 years ago, and social media wasn't really around. Facebook existed, most of us weren't on it. And if you wanted your news, you still had the major broadcast networks, the major cable networks, the major newspapers, and NPR. You didn't have a zillion different pop-up overnight blogs where people could put out their opinion, facts be damned, and it confirmed what other people wanted to see, and then it would go viral. There's a lot of information out there that merely confirms what people already believe, and no one's checking to see whether it's factual or not. No one's checking to see whether the organization is legitimate, whether it has trained reporters who are reporting to an editor who can be held, professionally responsible, who can get fired or sanctioned for putting out misinformation.
Oh, yeah. Well, there was one report on NPR recently about a group of people in Macedonia who were cutting and pasting stories, some text from here and some text from there, and then putting it all into a story and actually making money and getting quite wealthy on it.
There was a lot of that, and there was a lot of it on both sides of the aisle. It's definitely not just one side or the other. You've got sites that are blue colored, and you've got sites that are red colored, but both of them are spinning. Both sides are spinning the information that people want to hear. You take one event, let's say a protest in Florida, and you've got one site saying the police are fed up with these pro-Clinton protesters and they're arresting people, and you've got the other side saying, this woman was suppressed by the pro-Trump supporters and they don't want her voice heard. And then you've got the legitimate media says, yes, it was an anti-Trump protest. This woman was throwing bottles. She would have been arrested no matter which side she was on because that's assault. And it's hard, I think, when you're online to tell the difference sometimes, because it's so easy to just share the piece that you already believe in.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the perks that you have as the news editor at U.S. News and World Report.
Well, it's not so much now because I'm driving the bus, so I get to send other people out to scoop up those perks. When I worked for Yahoo, which is also, it's really international, I was a senior editor and writer for their women's focused site called Shine. And I also established the Women's in Politics section in the news section. And I was part of their election team in news. So my beat, really, I was writing about parenting, news and trends. I was writing about health, but I was also writing about politics. And part of that was covering the First Lady's office. So that meant I got to spend a lot of time in Washington, a lot of time at the White House, in meetings with myself and Michelle Obama and maybe 3 or 4 other reporters from other women-focused outlets. Huffington Post had someone there, and I think AOL had someone there, and it was really just 4 or 5 of us. And it was a great experience. We got to learn a lot about what the First Lady does. I call it politics without policy, because the First Lady's not writing laws. Her office is not implementing laws. But they get, throughout history, the First Ladies get to pick something that really affects your everyday life. I mean, say what you will about Bush, no one went, we don't like literacy. That's bad. I'm not going to support Laura Bush.
True.
Nancy Reagan, same thing. People think Reagan was the ultimate president. People think he was an awful president. No one said, I think more kids should do drugs. So it was an opportunity to really shape the country in a way that affects us directly. So I got to learn about and share stories about and research and report about Let's Move, about the Healthy Hunger-Free Child Act, about Gold Star families in joining forces. And that was really impactful for me. You learn about things that really affect our country and ways that you can have an effect that really are simple and easy and more people should be doing.
And so what is she like?
She's really interesting, smart, accomplished. I know a lot of people disagree with her husband's policies, but talking to her just felt like I was talking to a mentor, and we had similar goals. We want people to support military families. We want people to not let kids go hungry. We want people to live longer, healthier lives. We want kids to have opportunities to reach their full potential. And those are the things that our conversations were focused on. At one point, I did a 5-part video series for Yahoo where I interviewed Mrs. Obama and Dr. Biden about joining forces.
Dr. Jill Biden.
Dr. Jill Biden. And we were sitting in the White House, and they're fussing with our hair, and we're going over cue cards, and they're changing the lights. And Mrs. Obama turned to me and said, "It's so much warmer in Washington, D.C. My kids don't have to wear jackets under their Halloween costumes. What are your kids going as?" And we had this great conversation about Halloween and Halloween costumes. And I felt like I was talking to another working mom, and then all of a sudden realized, like, wait a second, that's the First Lady of the United States. And Dr. Biden and I are chatting about that, and she's a Gold Star mom. So her insight into what they were trying to do with joining forces was especially poignant. And it was just wonderful to see these two extremely accomplished women who are in these high-profile positions, who are so invested in something that affects the rest of us.
I think that's their charm and that's their draw, and we all can aspire to be a little bit more like them. But I love that story, that anecdote that you tell, because it feels like just another mom.
It really does. There was another meeting during the re-election, during Barack Obama's re-election, where she was campaigning for him, and we went out to this site in Virginia, and we're sitting in this back room of a church, and there's a big picnic table, and we're all talking. And she was talking about her daughters and about how one of them was kind of, I call it being a journalist, wait until deadline before you finish your work. And so her husband said, now, Malia, it might have been Sasha, but I think it was Malia, now it's really important that you apply yourself. You can't just slack off. And I know, because I was like you when I was a kid. I would delay all my work till the last minute. And she said, well, it seemed to work out pretty well for you then, Dad. So it's a good reminder that they're people dealing with the same stuff the rest of us parents are.
Yeah, I love that. I love that, knowing that. That's just so interesting. Tell us a little bit. So you were at the Globe for 16 years,
Yes.
and we did overlap, but you were a staff editor. And I was a correspondent, which means I got my assignments, but I didn't have to go into the Globe, and I was more of a freelancer, writing for a decade. But you were there from what year to what year?
I was there from 94 to 2010. So I started out as a copy editor in Living Arts, and I was one of the youngest they had ever hired. I'd actually just graduated from Syracuse University, and they said, we'd love for you to start in April. And I said, great, I graduate in May. And so we went with it. I learned a lot during my time there. I always say I grew up as a journalist at the Globe. And so I spent 4 years in Living Arts, and then I became the assistant national news editor. And my first day on the job, flying solo as the assistant national editor on a Sunday, John F. Kennedy Jr.'s plane went down. And so we had to scramble with correspondents in Washington covering politics, and correspondents in New York, and correspondents in Boston, and figure out how we were going to cover this tragedy. So I was in national news for another, I guess, from another 4 years. And then I got sucked into a project in IT. We were putting in a new front-end system, the word processing and the pagination system. So they selected a handful of editors and writers to become super users. And we'd sail in and train everyone in the section and hold down the fort while they were coming up to speed, and then move on to the next section. And then after that, I moved over to the Sunday magazine as an editor, and then eventually became the parenting writer for a while. In addition to editing, I kind of did this freelance job at my same job.
As a parent, was it a parenting column?
I took over for Barbara Meltz for a few years and wrote Child Caring.
I remember that column. It was wonderful.
It was a lot of fun. And it was mostly parenting news and trends, not mommy blogging. Wasn't really sharing my own kids' stories. I have 5 kids, 3 stepkids and 2 more from scratch. So they tell you, write what you know, right? That's what I knew at the time. That's what I was most comfortable with.
That's what I wanted to ask you. So for those who don't know, Lylah lives in Westford. That's why she's here. And I wanted to ask you if you could contrast your life in Westford with your U.S. News and World Report life. That, how does it work?
You kind of make it work. Some days I'm not sure how it works. It really depends on the day. I used to write, when I was at Yahoo, a lot about work-life balance, and my friends thought that was hilarious because I have very little of that. It's really more of a juggle, and half the time the rest of the balls you're juggling are under the couch with the dust bunnies you haven't vacuumed up from 1988. They're still there. But right now I split my time between Westford and DC. My family lives up here. The schools are great. We want our kids to have a stable place where they're growing up, so I commute. And in some ways, being down in Washington is hard. In some ways it's easier because I'm not racing to football or soccer or basketball or lacrosse and not getting lunches prepped and breakfast and dinners and laundry. I just get to the office and I work some more, and then I come back here and I'm juggling again.
It's so funny. What I always say is, even though my children are grown and launched, no matter what, when they're back in my life, they just suck the life out of you.
It's in a good way, though.
All the attention turns to them. Yes, it's in a wonderful way, and I wouldn't have it any other way.
Well, I was volunteering at one of my kids' schools during library time, and someone was asking me how I make time for it. And I honestly believe I work really hard and I commute, but the stuff that I'm doing here, that's kind of the most important thing. I'm working to live. I'm not living to work.
Right. And that's a really wonderful philosophy. So just to clarify, you have 5 children. 2 of them live with
Only
you here
2 are
in
still
Westford.
at home.
And I know this because I'm on Facebook with you.
The rest are
those
out and
2
about.
are rather famous.
One graduated from college in May. Another's a junior in college. Another's finishing up high school. And then I have 2 with 6th grader and a 4th grader.
Who are in Westford schools.
Who are in Westford schools.
Yeah.
Larger than life.
Yeah. They are on Facebook, definitely. So, and I'm really interested. I love hearing about the beginning of successful careers, and so this Princeton Packet, where you started
I love
your
the Packet. It's a tiny newspaper. Comes out twice a week. I'm born and raised in Princeton, New Jersey. Went to Princeton Day School, and our school was very unique. At the time, we had something called Senior Project, where you could drop everything, all your classes, all your sports, for your last semester, and do a project in whatever you thought you wanted to major in. My junior year, I thought I was going to be a pediatrician, and my lab partner watched me do a horrible job dissecting a frog, and said, "You know,
remember the frogs."
Yeah, he's like, "You know, you really love journalism. Maybe you should do that." And I thought, like, can I really do that? And it turns out, yes, you can really do that. And so I applied to school. I opted to go to Syracuse to the SI Newhouse School for Public Communication, dropped all my classes and started working at the Packet. I had worked as the editor-in-chief of my high school newspaper, and so I got thrown into the mix as a cub reporter. And it was really great. Got to talk to people. I learned something new every day, and that's something that's carried through. It's been more time than I'd like to admit, more than 25 years since then. I still learn something new every day, and that's really the biggest perk of this job. So I was working there, and then when I went to Syracuse, I continued working for the Packet. I had freelance from Syracuse, and I'd come back during vacations and work at the little newspaper. And then got an internship which morphed into a full-time job at the Syracuse Post-Standard, which I juggled while going to school full-time. I was the automotive editor there, which was hilarious because I was too young to rent a car, but I could test drive them. Didn't do much of that, but it was still a lot of fun.
Wow.
And what I tell kids now when they ask me how they can get started is say yes. Say yes to every opportunity. Try it once. If it doesn't work, you don't have to do it again. But if you say no instead of trying it, you'll never know. You'll never know whether you love TV, but it turns out you're better at radio. You'll never know if you don't want to be a journalist, you'd rather be, pick anything else, underwater basket weaving. But if you don't try, you'll never know.
That's excellent advice. When I look back on my own career path, I can say that the mistakes I made were when I didn't say yes. So that's a really, really good advice. Do you remember, what's the most memorable story that you covered while you were at the Packet? Do you remember?
The one I loved best was a profile on a friend of mine. His name was Doug Adderley, and he was a kid who grew up in inner city Trenton, not a lot of opportunities, and a mentor brought him to Princeton Day, where I went to school, and he just did amazing. He turned out he had a natural affinity for tennis. He became this superstar tennis athlete and went on to do some really, really great things. But profiling him as someone who was friends with him at the time, it was really eye-opening, because here was this person who I took for granted had the same kind of life I did. No, of course not. It was a big window into another world for me. And that's when I realized that journalism, especially feature writing, could really be a way to introduce people to thoughts that they hadn't really bothered to consider before. I know back then the feature pages were considered the women's pages, supposed to be about babies and fashion and maybe puppies. And there was this opportunity to just introduce new cultures, introduce new thoughts, introduce new opportunities for people and introduce people to each other that I just really loved.
Wonderful. You probably can't tell us what you're working on now.
It's mostly inauguration.
Oh, that's true, yeah.
The transition is big right now, all the appointees coming and going. And trying to make sure we don't normalize the abnormal. There are some things.
What do you mean by that?
It's a lot of what we're seeing now, the screaming fights on Twitter, the calls for recounts, the push to have electors not vote according to law and instead to vote their conscience. Those things aren't normal. Those things rarely happen. Having appointees who have publicly derided or vowed to close or have been suing the departments that they're now in charge of protecting, that hasn't happened before. A labor secretary who is very anti-worker and pro-automation, we haven't seen that before. So it's tempting to just say, so-and-so has been named to secretary of thus and such. But you need to provide context. You need to provide background. And so we're making sure that that's what we're providing, the news, but also the context into which it fits.
It does seem like it. I watched CNN the other night. I was at Boost working out, and I watch the shows that I can't get on my own TV at home, and I was watching CNN, and it did almost seem like the commentators were sort of accepting how everything is falling into place the way it is. And
it's interesting. That's one of the big differences between broadcast and print. Broadcast, you need the sound bites. You need the video snippets. You need to keep people's attention. They can change the channel really easily. In print, even online, sure, they could surf away to another site, but you have an infinite news hole. You have an opportunity to present a lot more information, to highlight keywords and have people click through and have them chase their own rabbit down the rabbit hole to get the background and the more information they want and they need. So we're not reliant on the shiny, I call it the shiny, the look over here, the oh, squirrels. And we don't have to present something with the fanfare that maybe makes for good television, which is another reason why I love being in print, but I enjoy appearing on television every once in a while because it is exciting and it is nice to be able to bring maybe a slightly different perspective on the news to a television audience.
Well, we just have a few seconds left to this interview, and I thank you so much, Lylah, for coming on.
Thank you, my pleasure. So more information is at usnews.com. You can follow along there and follow me on Twitter if you like. I'm at Write, Edit, Repeat.
And we all will. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.